In the autumn of 1943, reports began to arrive at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. They came by courier, by coded telegram, from naval attaches and intelligence officers stationed in neutral cities, Lisbon, Stockholm, Buenos Aires. The reports were typed on thin paper, stamped with red seals, and they spoke of things the High Command had not fully anticipated. They spoke of factories. Not just any factories, but vast industrial complexes spreading across the American Midwest and along the coasts, places with names like Willow Run, Kaiser Shipyards, and the Newport News Yards. The reports described assembly lines that seemed to stretch without end, where bomber frames were pieced together in sections, moving slowly down tracks like patient rivers of aluminum and steel. At first, these reports were read with interest, but not alarm. Japan's leaders knew that America was large, that it was wealthy. But they had believed, hoped, perhaps, that the American people lacked the will to sustain a long war. That the distance across the Pacific was protection enough. That Japan's early victories would buy time, would force negotiation, would lead to a peace that left the empire intact. But the numbers in the reports told a different story. One document, translated from English and circulated among staff officers, described the production goals set by the United States War Production Board. It listed monthly outputs: tanks, aircraft, artillery shells, cargo ships. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of aircraft per month. Hundreds of ships. Enough ammunition to supply not one front, but many. And slowly, in those quiet rooms where maps covered every wall, a realization began to form. Japan's own factories, spread across the home islands and occupied territories, were running at full capacity. Workers labored in shifts. Resources were stretched. Aluminum was scarce. Rubber had to be synthesized. Fuel was rationed even for military use. And yet, even at their peak, Japan's industries could not match even a fraction of what the reports described. One senior staff officer, reading through a translated summary of American Liberty ship production, paused at a particular figure. The Americans were now launching a new cargo ship every few days. He set the paper down and stared at the wall, where a map of the Pacific showed the vast blue distances his nation was trying to control. It was one thing to win battles. It was another to sustain a war across an ocean, against an opponent who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. The room was quiet, except for the rustle of paper and the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticked softly. The light from the window was pale, filtering through rice paper screens, casting everything in a gentle, muted glow. And in that light, the reports sat in neat stacks, each one a whisper of the same truth. The war was becoming a contest of production, not just courage. A test of factories, not just fleets. Outside, in the gardens of the headquarters, the leaves were beginning to turn. Autumn in Tokyo is a quiet season, a time of reflection. And inside, as the daylight faded, officers bent over their desks, reading and rereading the numbers, trying to find some way to make them say something different. But the numbers did not change. And the quiet understanding grew, like shadows lengthening across a still pond. The weapon that truly surprised Japan's high command was not a bomb, or a battleship, or even a new type of aircraft. It was something more fundamental, something that could not be sunk or shot down. It was the American capacity for replacement. In early 1942, after the initial shock of Pearl Harbor, Japan had achieved a series of rapid victories. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered. The sweep across the Pacific and into Southeast Asia had been swift, and for a moment, it seemed the gamble had paid off. American and Allied forces were reeling, retreating, desperately trying to hold what remained. But by late 1943, something had shifted. Japanese pilots returning from combat missions over the Solomon Islands brought back troubling observations. The American pilots they faced were often inexperienced, true, but there were always more of them. If a squadron was decimated one week, a new squadron appeared the next. The planes themselves, too, arrived in steady streams. Wildcats, then Hellcats. Dauntless dive bombers, then Avengers. And each model, the pilots noted, seemed to be produced in quantities that defied reason. One naval aviator, debriefing after a mission near Rabaul, tried to explain it to his commanding officer. "They don't seem to run out," he said quietly. "We shoot down 10, and 20 come back. We sink a carrier, and another one arrives." The officer nodded slowly. He had read the intelligence summaries. He knew what the pilot did not yet fully grasp, that America was not just replacing losses. It was expanding. Building more than it lost. Growing stronger, month by month, while Japan's own strength was slowly being ground away. In the shipyards of the Pacific, Japanese engineers and naval architects studied photographs of captured American equipment. They examined the construction of a downed B-17 bomber, noting the simplicity of its design, the way parts seemed almost interchangeable. They looked at the armor plating on a destroyed Sherman tank, at the welding techniques, at the mass-produced components. And they understood something that their counterparts in Berlin were also beginning to realize. The Americans had designed their weapons not for elegance, but for volume. For mass production. For the ability to train a factory worker in weeks, rather than years, and still produce a functional, effective machine. Japanese aircraft, by contrast, were often marvels of engineering. The Zero fighter was light, maneuverable, deadly in the hands of a skilled pilot. But it took time to build. It required experienced craftsmen. And when one was lost, replacing it, and the pilot, was a slow, difficult process. The Americans had made a different choice. Their planes were heavier, their tanks were simpler, their ships were built from standardized sections welded together in vast open-air yards. And because of this, they could produce them in numbers that seemed, to Japanese observers, almost impossible. There was a phrase that began to circulate quietly among staff officers in Tokyo. It was never written in official reports, never spoken in formal meetings. But in the quiet moments, over tea, in the corridors, they would say it. "We are fighting their factories." And they knew, though they did not always say it aloud, that this was a battle they could not win. The evening light filtered through the windows of the headquarters building, soft and golden. Outside, the city carried on. People walked home from work. Shopkeepers closed their shutters. Somewhere, a temple bell rang, low and steady, marking the hour. And inside, in those quiet rooms, the understanding deepened, slow and inevitable as the turning of the seasons. There was another realization, quieter than the first, that came to Japan's naval commanders as the war dragged into its third year. It had to do with something most people never think about when they imagine war, the vast, invisible network of supply that makes modern combat possible. The Americans, it turned out, had not just built weapons. They had built an entire system to move them across the world. Japanese submarines, prowling the waters between Hawaii and the Solomon Islands, reported sighting convoys of cargo ships, dozens at a time, moving in coordinated groups. These were not warships. They were transports, Liberty ships, Victory ships, tankers, supply vessels, each one carrying thousands of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and equipment. And they moved in a steady, unending stream. For Japan, supply had always been a challenge. The empire stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, from the home islands to the Dutch East Indies, to the edges of India and deep into China. Every outpost, every garrison, every airfield required food, fuel, and ammunition. And moving these supplies meant risking submarines, air attacks, and the constant threat of interception. By 1943, Japanese merchant shipping was being sunk faster than it could be replaced. Convoys limped into port with half their number missing. Tankers carrying precious oil from the East Indies were torpedoed by American submarines. transports carrying reinforcements to isolated garrisons simply disappeared. And meanwhile, the Americans were doing the opposite. Their merchant fleet was growing. Their convoys were getting larger, better protected, more frequent. Their logistics network stretched from the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh all the way to forward bases in the Pacific, and it functioned with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. Japanese intelligence officers, piecing together captured documents and intercepted communications, tried to map this network. They drew diagrams showing the flow of supplies from the American mainland to Pearl Harbor, then to forward bases in the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Philippines. And as they drew, they began to understand the scale of what they were facing. The Americans had not just planned for war. They had planned for a long war. They had built storage depots, fuel dumps, repair facilities. They had trained tens of thousands of logistics personnel, clerks, mechanics, drivers, quartermasters, whose sole job was to keep the supply lines moving. One captured American manual, translated and circulated among Japanese staff officers, detailed the procedures for unloading a transport ship at a forward base. It described how cargo was categorized, how it was inventoried, how it was distributed to units based on priority. The level of organization was humbling. Japan had warriors. Japan had courage, discipline, and a willingness to sacrifice. But it did not have this. It did not have the vast, patient, unglamorous machinery of supply that allowed an army to fight thousands of miles from home, month after month, without faltering. And so, slowly, the strategic picture became clear. Every battle Japan won came at a cost that could not be easily replaced. Every plane lost, every ship sunk, every experienced pilot killed, these were losses that accumulated, that wore down Japan's strength like water wearing away stone. The Americans, by contrast, could afford to lose. They could take casualties, lose battles, even lose entire campaigns, and still come back stronger. Because behind every defeat, there were factories running, ships being launched, pilots being trained. The understanding settled over the high command like a heavy blanket, muffling hope. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the cherry trees in the garden. Inside, the maps on the walls showed an empire that stretched across half the Pacific, vast and impressive. But the men studying those maps knew the truth now. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting an economy. And the quiet afternoon light faded, slow and soft, into evening. There is a moment in every long war when the numbers stop being abstract and become painfully, undeniably real. For Japan's high command, that moment came sometime in mid-1944, when the arithmetic of attrition became impossible to ignore. The calculations were simple, brutal, and final. Staff officers, working late into the night, compiled loss reports from across the Pacific. They tallied aircraft destroyed, ships sunk, pilots killed. They compared these numbers to production figures, to training outputs, to the dwindling reserves of fuel and raw materials. And then, quietly, they did the same calculations for the Americans. The disparity was staggering. For every Japanese aircraft lost, perhaps one, if they were lucky, could be replaced. Experienced pilots, men who had trained for years, who had flown in combat since the war's beginning, were replaceable. When they died, their skill, their knowledge, their instinct, all of it died with them. The Americans, by contrast, were losing planes and pilots too. But their losses were being replaced at a rate that seemed almost supernatural. New pilots arrived from training schools in Texas and Florida, young men with perhaps a few hundred hours of flight time, thrust into combat with minimal experience. Many of them died in their first few missions. But enough survived. And those who survived gained experience. And meanwhile, more arrived to replace them. Japan was trading veterans for novices. And losing. The same pattern held true across every category. Japanese destroyers, sunk in night battles or by air attack, took months to replace, if they could be replaced at all. American destroyers were being launched from shipyards on both coasts, faster than Japan could sink them. Japanese submarines, once a proud and effective force, were being hunted by American aircraft and destroyers equipped with increasingly sophisticated sonar and depth charges. By 1944, Japanese submarine losses had become unsustainable. And the oil was running out. Without oil from the Dutch East Indies, Japan's navy could not operate. Its aircraft could not fly. Its factories could not run. And the sea routes between the oil fields and the home islands were becoming increasingly dangerous, patrolled by American submarines that operated with impunity. One evening, in a quiet conference room, a senior naval officer presented a report to a small group of colleagues. The report was classified, its contents too sensitive for wide distribution. It laid out, in stark terms, the projected lifespan of Japan's remaining fuel reserves. At current consumption rates, assuming no major new losses, the reserves would last perhaps 6 more months. Maybe 8, if they rationed severely. And if the Americans continued to sink tankers at the current rate, less. The officer closed the folder and looked around the room. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The numbers spoke for themselves. Outside, Tokyo was dark. Blackout regulations kept the streets unlit, and the city seemed to hold its breath in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, low and mournful. Inside the conference room, the men sat in silence, the weight of understanding pressing down on them. They had known for some time that the war was not going as planned. But now, looking at the numbers, they understood something deeper and more final. They understood that the war could not be won. Not by courage. Not by sacrifice. Not by will. The Americans had more of everything. More planes, more ships, more tanks, more oil, more steel, more people. And most importantly, they had the capacity to keep producing, to keep replacing, to keep coming, month after month, year after year if necessary. And Japan did not. The room was quiet, lit only by a single lamp on the table, its light soft and amber. The maps on the walls showed an empire. But the numbers on the table told a different story. And the night deepened, and the understanding settled, heavy and unchanging as stone. Understanding is one thing. Acting on that understanding is something else entirely. By late 1944, Japan's high command knew the war could not be won. The reports were clear. The numbers were undeniable. The American advance across the Pacific was methodical, relentless, and backed by an industrial capacity that Japan could not match, could not outlast, could not hope to overcome. And yet, the war continued. There were many reasons for this. Pride, certainly. The cultural weight of Bushido, the warrior code that taught that surrender was worse than death. The political reality that no one in the leadership wanted to be the first to speak the word surrender, to be remembered as the one who gave up. But there was also something else, something quieter and more human. There was the knowledge that speaking the truth, saying out loud what the numbers showed, would mean admitting that every sacrifice made since Pearl Harbor, every soldier's death, every city bombed, every family's loss, had been in vain. And so the meetings continued. Plans were drawn up for last-ditch defenses. Resources were hoarded for a final stand. Talk turned to concepts like decisive battle, honorable death, 100 million souls dying together. But in the quiet moments, in the private conversations late at night, some officers allowed themselves to acknowledge what they had come to understand. They had underestimated America. Not its courage. They had never doubted that Americans could fight. But they had underestimated the sheer, unglamorous, overwhelming power of American industry. They had believed that distance would protect them, that the Pacific was too vast, that supply lines would stretch and break, that the American public would tire of war. They had been wrong on all counts. The Americans had turned their entire nation into a war machine. They had mobilized not just their military, but their factories, their farms, their universities, their research labs. They had put women to work building bombers. They had trained teenagers to fly fighters. They had organized their economy with a ruthlessness that matched any military campaign. And they had done it faster, and more completely, than Japan had thought possible. One officer, in his private diary, a diary that would be found decades later, tucked away in a family archive, wrote a single entry in the summer of 1945, just weeks before the end. "We fought bravely. Our men gave everything. But we were fighting the 20th century itself. And we had no answer for it." The diary was never meant to be read by others. It was just a moment of honesty, written in the quiet of a dark room, by a man who had finally allowed himself to admit what he had known for over a year. The war would end soon after. The bombs would fall. The surrender would come. But the understanding, the slow, painful realization of what Japan's leaders had finally grasped about American weapons, about American production, about the nature of modern industrial war, that understanding had come much earlier. It had come in quiet rooms, in translated reports, in columns of numbers that told a story no one wanted to hear. It had come slowly, like dawn breaking over a cold sea. And by the time it arrived, it was far, far too late. The night is still now. The story has been told. And if you've listened this far, let yourself drift now, let the details fade, let the numbers and the names blur into the gentle fog of sleep. History happened. It cannot be changed. But we can learn from it, quietly, in the spaces between waking and dreams. Rest now. Sleep well. And let the past settle softly around you, like autumn leaves falling on still water. Good night.